David Lammy is a Labour Party politician and current Shadow Secretary of State for Justice and Shadow Lord Chancellor. He has served as MP from Tottenham since 2000 and as Minister for Culture under the last Labour government. David is known for being vocal on topics of race and inequality, in particular in the UK's criminal justice system. He has been a vocal critic of the government's response to the 2017 Grenfell Tower fire and its policies surrounding the Windrush generation. He joins us today for a conversation about his latest book, Tribes: How Our Need to Belong Can Make or Break Society, which was published earlier this year. David, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you very much for having me.
I wanted to start off in a similar place actually to where your book starts, by asking about how your childhood and the places in which you grew up have shaped your politics.
Well, yes. I mean, obviously, we're all a product to some extent of our background. And in this era of huge division, I guess my book was almost a source of therapy, somewhere I could return to and really think about who I am. And that was really against the backdrop of so many people challenging my right to be British or to be English. My background, I suppose, was to a large extent determined by growing up in Tottenham during the 1970s, having parents who were of the Windrush generation. My father arrived in Britain in 1956. I talk in the book about that sort of Caribbean home in which I grew up, who my mother was, who my father was, the village that they came from in Guyana, South America, and the story that is that story of that country, which is a country where obviously enslaved Africans ploughed the plantations, and then after the end of slavery, indentured workers arrived from India, including my great grandmother, in fact, from Calcutta to Guyana. And so I'm a product of the Caribbean to some extent and the Commonwealth. I'm a small, product of small C conservative parents in the way that immigrants can be. They take education very seriously and discipline and finding your way in the new country in which they've arrived. But also that business of being a second generation immigrant, so therefore being Black British, and growing up with the dislocation really of that search for identity, who I am, what I am, and my place in this country that is my home. But I also in the book take a DNA test, which takes me back to one of the tribes that emerges in that DNA, and that's the Tuareg tribe that are based in Niger. And that was an amazing experience for me to spend time with these Black Muslims in Niger and to have them take me in as one of them. And also the city of Peterborough, where I spent 7 years of my life as a cathedral chorister in Peterborough Cathedral at a boarding school. And that Middle England city has given me so much, and I'm not sure I would be the Member of Parliament today, never mind the Member of Parliament for Tottenham, were it not for what Peterborough gave me. So those are the three areas of my background that I wanted to think about and I reflect on as a way into this subject, that is the new tribalism.
So you went on to study law at SOAS in London, followed by which you became the first Black Briton, I believe, to attend Harvard Law School. Could you tell us about your time at Harvard and how your experiences of race and class compared between the two countries?
Well, I mean, I think that I was the first in my family to go to university, and I don't want to undersell the experience of coming out of Russell Square tube station, wearing a suit, going to SOAS for an interview, because I got into SOAS actually through clearing, and the amazement of going to that wonderful college that's part of the University of London. but also on from there, going on to Harvard Law School, sort of by accident, really. There was a show on TV at the time called LA Law. There was a great black lawyer in it, and I wanted to be him. And there were some kids just a year or so ahead of me who'd taken the Inns of Court School of Law, that's the British bar school, to court because they were failing black children. I thought I'd better have a plan B. So that was how I ended up at Harvard. And they told me at the time you'd be the first black Briton to come to the law school. And obviously it was exciting to do that. And it was very hard to do because I didn't have the money to go, but I was helped by some Jewish lawyers who helped me to go, for which I'll be eternally grateful. Look, I think that studying at both SOAS and Harvard was an amazing experience. It was obviously, Harvard's a huge global institution, and SOAS is one of the most global universities in our country. So it was a very global experience, bringing me into contact with lots of different sorts of people. SOAS particularly is keen to sort of throw away just the Eurocentric canon and examine things from different points of view and different cultural points of view, which was incredibly exciting at the time. There were some big things going on in Britain at the time, the Birmingham 6, the Guildford 4, the Tottenham 3, poll tax riots, the end of Margaret Thatcher. So it was a very exciting time to be in London. And Harvard was hugely exciting. It was the Clinton period, Monica Lewinsky, change in America, and frankly, America as a country is one that's always fascinated me. I visit nearly every year. And there's something about the can-do nature and about the way America, isn't it? There's a reason why the modern novel is largely written in America and why storytelling and Hollywood is as big as it is. And there's something sort of intoxicating about the United States and possible about the United States in a way that Europe can somehow be suffocating and sort of keep you in your boxes. So I hugely enjoyed my experience of being at Harvard, and then also working in the States. I sort of left America with huge confidence really in who I was and my place in the world. But I think the other thing that can happen, when you're the first to do something, and there'll be some of your listeners that understand this, is you can end up in a place with a kind of sort of Stockholm syndrome, who am I, what am I, quite lonely. And that definitely was something that I experienced in my sort of late 20s, which I write about in the book as well.
Going back to the DNA test that you mentioned, which made you kind of go back to places like Niger and explore your roots, could you tell us about the conversations you had with the tribes there and how their response was to you actually going back and looking for the places that your ancestors came from?
Well, the thing I didn't know about Niger that I came to understand about Niger is that it's one of the places in the world where slavery continues, where human trafficking continues, and where women particularly are stolen from families and sold. And some of that is associated with kind of gradients of colour. And it's very likely that my female ancestor was in some way a slave. And so what they found unbelievable was that I was sort of keen to claim the Tamashek Tuaregs as my own. I'm very proud to say, well, I'm also the descendant of enslaved people, or double enslaved people, if you like. And they really took me in. I also found, look, I'm a Christian. My Christian faith matters to me, is important to me. And yet I found the sort of Muslim brotherhood in Niger very comforting. Praying with these men was a deep experience. They were very kind, very generous. They took me in. I went on this journey. And I said to them at the end, when I stand up in the House of Commons, I stand a bit taller as a consequence of knowing a little bit more about where I'm from. And I say that because I think if you're the descendant of enslaved people, which is obviously common across the Caribbean and our African American cousins, there's a bit of you that's deeply insecure that you don't really know where you're from. But yet at the end, I suppose, have to accept that I'm not Nigerian, I'm not Tamashek, I'm not Tuareg, really. I'm English, with a bit of the Caribbean thrown in. So this business of belonging and who are you, what is it? It's a mercurial thing.
Which leads me very nicely, actually, to talking about the central theme in your book, which is that tribes stem from the desire within all human beings to belong. So with that kind of idea in mind, how do you explain the kind of fluctuating trends of tribalism in society? That there are some years and decades when society seems incredibly divided, and others where there appears to be quite a lot of unity and consensus.
Look, the first thing to understand is, whilst I do explore the anthropological basis of tribes, I totally accept that the whole concept of tribes has dropped out of fashion. The tribes, when I was learning geography in primary school, which was very common, became, certainly by the time I went to the School of Orient and African Studies, something that sociologists, anthropologists, cultural historians were stepping away from, because they understood it to be a very sort of colonial term to often describe people who were non-white, and frankly, a term that was white supremacist often in its tendencies, wanting to accentuate one group of people, most often Europeans, as being cultured and civilized, and other groups of people, most often being African or Asian, as somehow primitive or backward. So tribes fell out of fashion, and so it should have done, and we tend now just to talk about ethnic groups or different groups. However, the phenomenon that I was looking at in the book is the new tribalism. And the new tribalism is a phrase coined by a philosopher called Mafasoli around 1988, 1990. I was certainly learning about his work at Harvard, and it talks about these new communities of feeling. And if anything, that's been accentuated since we moved into this digital age of social media and other things. And so, yes, it's about division, but it's also about the way that people find these new communities. And you see it on Twitter every day of the week. You see the division accentuated, and it's something that clearly in this age of Trump, of Farage, of Bolsonaro, and to some extent of Boris Johnson, you see a kind of populist, nationalist, authoritarian tendency also that ramps this up. But you also see on the political left a kind of tribalism that I think slightly engulfed the Labour Party in its incarnation that led to that devastating defeat last year. So that's the phenomenon that I interrogate in the book. And I look at identity politics, I look at loneliness and mental health, and come out the other end in terms of renewal, talking about the localism that's necessary, and the national story and storytelling and nation building that you've got to be engaged in, as well as the global challenges that we face. But you can't get to those global challenges of dealing with climate change, of dealing with refugees, of dealing with a pandemic, unless your local and your national is happening to overcome those tribal instincts that are innate in human beings. And, you know, the neuroscience, the sociology is in the book that demonstrates that that is instinctive in human nature. And there are some tribes that are very, very healthy and deep, or some tribal instinct that's very, very healthy and deep. But if you don't watch it, you can end up in a very polarized, divided place in which we just go off and associate with people like us, and which we hate and condemn those who are slightly different.
So your book describes Thatcherism to have been at the very root of the new tribalism that we see in Britain today. So Thatcher came to power during what was already an increasingly divided and divisive time in British politics. So was her time in office, do you think, simply an extension of these divisions, or was it something completely different?
No, I think I want to qualify that. I don't think the book says Thatcherism's at its root. I think it's a bit deeper than that. I think neoliberalism has something to say that increases that, and that is the age of individualism, both in terms of laissez-faire economics of Margaret Thatcher, but to some extent continued under people like Bill Clinton, Tony Blair. So that economic liberalism definitely has led to some extent, not just to growing inequalities, but a particularly atomized place. But it's not just somehow a sort of right account. It's also the truth is a liberal left account can lead to a place where we're all aware of our rights, but we're not aware of our responsibility. And therefore you get into also the modern identity politics problem of you're defending your group, but struggling to come back together again. So I don't want to lay it all at the blame of Margaret Thatcher, even though it's, obviously it would be, I would quite enjoy doing that as a left-wing politician. I tried in the book to be a bit more panoptic and look outward than just the critique of Thatcherism. But the point is, I guess, that after a period, broadly through after the war, 1950s, 1960s, we land in a place that then leads to where we are today. And that's a souped up individualism that you can see in both the left and right account, as well as inequality, that leads to this atomized culture that's then amplified by social media. I think that's what I'm trying to say.
Mm-hmm. So going back to your personal experiences, you ran for office and became a cabinet minister in the Blair era. So I just wonder, how do you think these years featured into this new tribalism, and to what extent have they laid the foundation for the world and the divisions we see today?
Well, look, I think that when I became a politician, people talked about apathy. Fukuyama was writing about the end of history. Politics apparently had consolidated very much in the center. Division, almost, not that there wasn't racism and prejudice, but somehow the story of the 20th century, the great story of the 20th century, which was the way in which Black and brown people and formerly colonized people, the way in which gay men and women, the way in which women, the way in which working people had been able to self-actualize in their lifetime, fighting for their rights because of people like Gandhi, Mandela, Emily Pankhurst, Harvey Milk and others. That story had come to fruition, and almost people thought, well, look, there's nothing else to fight about. My God, how naive that looks today when we see that actually division, authoritarianism, and a sort of nationalist populism is writ large. So I would say don't underestimate how those Blair, Clinton, Cameron years felt, nothing like they do today. It's only in 2015 that David Cameron asked me to lead a review into the disproportionality of Black and ethnic minorities in the criminal justice system. This is a Conservative Prime Minister reaching across the aisle, ringing up a Black MP in the Labour Party and saying, look, David, can you help me? And me saying, yeah, sure, I'll help as long as you give me the resources. And I produced a review that was widely lauded on both sides of the political divide. I don't think we can imagine that today. I don't think anyone could imagine Boris Johnson ringing up me and saying, David, can you give me a hand? It just doesn't, we're not into a big tent place in which that happens from either side. And equally, I don't think anyone could imagine Jeremy Corbyn ringing up Priti Patel and saying, can you help me sort out a particular problem? So the point is, politics has changed very rapidly in this last period. There's been a sort of turbo rocket to some of the phenomenon that was there previously underlying society. And it goes back to this point that I'm making, that tribalism is innate and can either be ramped up and inflamed and encouraged, or can be, kept at bay, if you like, by a broader national or local story, by finding common purpose, things that can bind us together. And there are countries that are better at this, I think, than perhaps our own, countries like Canada, countries like modern Germany, having had terrible atrocities, are keen to sell a common story, so as not to see the atrocities that they've seen in the past.
Before we go on to talking a bit further about kind of party politics in Britain, I wonder if you could tell us a bit about the 2015 review into the criminal justice system, and actually the slightly broader problem that the criminal justice system in the UK faces today.
Well, it's to say that the problem the UK faces is no different to the problem faced by lots of developed countries all over the world. Most countries, if you visit their jails, jail their minorities in large numbers. I'm told that in Iceland, they jail Greenlanders. In New Zealand, Australia, Canada, Indigenous communities are way overrepresented in the criminal justice system. I don't need to tell your audience about the problems in the United States of America, save to say, when I looked at the figures in the UK, that actually per capita, we have a bigger problem of jailing black men in the United States of America, and it's not understood sufficiently. And as I speak to you, 51% of our youth justice system, if you look at our prisons for our young people, 51% of our young people are from black or ethnic minority background. That's an extraordinary number when you think about their proportion in the population as a whole. So there's a significant issue. Of course, there are pipeline issues in our education system who get excluded from school, our care system who's represented in care. There are historic injustices. One of the most overrepresented group, for which we don't even keep the figures, are gypsies and travellers. And there's a growing population of Muslim men and women in our prison system as well. So there's a significant issue that begins pretty early in the system, but it's then compounded at every stage. Now, there's a lot of discussion in Britain about issues like stop and search and the policing side of this story, but it doesn't just begin and end with policing. There are issues in our courts. Who are our judges? Where do they come from? There are issues and charging decisions made in relation to ethnic minority groups that you don't see in other communities, although broadly the CPS did come out of my review quite well. And of course, there are real issues in our prisons, particularly with recidivism rates for black men as high as 65%. Now, if 65% of black men go into prison, come out of prison, and then go back into prison, that tells you something about how successful the prison system is in relation to rehabilitation. So all of those were the issues that I looked at. I then came up with 35 recommendations in relation to the system. I was concerned about the criminal records regime that we have in our country, which is really punitive. You know, you have to declare your criminal record on nearly every form you fill in after you've left prison. And clearly it stops you getting employment, which keeps you in a life of crime. I was concerned about the way in which we force young people to plead guilty, not guilty, rather than just dealing with the problem that we've got in front of us. And I was attracted to some of the success that they've had in New Zealand with a different category, calling it not contested, if you like, and not forcing young people into making that guilty, not guilty decision. I raised issues around recruitment of prison governors and prison staff. I raised issues around a diverse judiciary. And I raised some issues around how we could move forward with a more reformed youth justice system and probation, of course, which is a very important area. So it's a lengthy review. I'd encourage, you can find it on the web, I'd encourage you all to read it. And clearly now I'm in this role as Shadow Justice Secretary, I'll be taking forward many of these ideas.
Going back to the Labour Party, which you also admit in your book as being an example of kind of a tribe in modern Britain, in the sense that you described. So the Labour Party's had an incredibly difficult 10 or so years. So I wonder if you could tell us about how the Corbyn years factor into this crisis of division that Britain sees today.
Well, let's be clear, we're having this conversation after Labour lost an election where we're down to the worst we've done since 1935, smaller number of MPs than we've seen in this modern era, a situation in which we were perceived to be hugely factional, more preoccupied with rowing with ourselves, in which the anti-Semitism in the Labour Party left a very nasty taste in the mouths of the general public. I think in which, if you look at the seats that we retained, they're largely in cities, not in towns. We got votes for public sector workers, but not much else. We got young people behind us, but not those who were much older than 40 or so. So clearly, we got into a narrow tribal place, and our tribe was not sufficient to form the broad coalition that the Labour Party requires in office. And that is to be in a persuasive place where you're taking people with you and they think you can improve their lives. And there's a big, big job to do. But in the book, yes, I talk about moments in which my own party could be tribal. I deplored the anti-Semitism and was pleased to stand with Jewish brothers and sisters who stood with me in the past. And I was very, very clear that political parties, I talk about an example which I get into trouble with Ed Miliband, can also be incredibly tribal. And it's very hard, actually, to criticise your own party when you see your own party doing things wrong.
So I just wanted to touch briefly on the anti-Semitism crisis that you mentioned. What, in your view, were the roots of this crisis in the party, and why was it not addressed sooner by the leadership or by the party members? And why did the party fail to move on from it until a new leader was elected?
Well, look, I think that there's a strain of the left that confuses anti-capitalism with anti-Semitism. And very quickly falls into tropes about the Jewish community. Now, there are tropes about the community I'm from, that black men are lazy, black men are sexually promiscuous, black men are violent and to be feared. And you can see those tropes sometimes played out in narrative stories, in film, in books, and you can certainly see them in parts of our tabloid newspapers. But equally, there are tropes about the Jewish community somehow controlling the world, conspiracy theories around George Soros, same ones that we use about the Rothschild family, and hook noses and a whole set of stuff, really, control of the media and newspapers that play out, and they play out from the left. They can play out from the right, of course, and that, the worst example of that, of course, was 1930s Germany, but they can play out from the left, and I'm afraid it gripped parts of our party as our party particularly, I think, allowed new people to enter it that had come from other left traditions. I think that's what happened. And there was a failure to deal with it and take it very seriously, and a tone that was constantly excusing racism and anti-Semitism. And it just became the story. So that's what I think happened. I don't know if I've got more wisdom on this than anybody else, and many people have commented on this and said exactly the right things, but it was a deeply depressing moment. And I say that as someone who, that's not to say, by the way, that you cannot have a critique of the State of Israel and deep empathy and concern for the Palestinian people, wanted a two-state solution, be deeply concerned about settlements. It's not to say that, but it's to say that those issues almost become obscured in the wider anti-Semitism that can grip and take hold, and I'm afraid did take hold in our party.
I wanted to turn now, for the interest of time, to speaking about the tragedy of the Grenfell Tower fire, which, I mean, showed which showed as being symptomatic of a deeply divided and unequal Britain. Nearly 3 years on, how do you make sense of the tragedy, and what does the road ahead look like for the people of the community?
Well, look, I think that a starting point for this terrible event was, of course, this was preventable. It should never have happened. It should never, ever have been the case that those people burned to death in their homes. You know, many of your listeners will live in houses, you know, where they fitted smoke alarms, or their parents have, where they can get out of the building should smoke come, jump out the windows. They'd broadly be all right. I think when you live at the hands of the state, and the best way to think about this is that if you were in a school or if you were in a hospital, you rely on the state to protect you, and the state failed. And what was awful about this is that those individuals were raising their concerns about the safety of their building long before this happened. I had a dear friend that lost her life. She lived with her mother, Khadija Say. My wife had supported her. My wife's an artist, Nicola Green, and she worked with my wife and for my wife. My wife mentored her and encouraged her. And she died in her early 20s with her whole life before her. And Khadija reminded me of me, a young woman from the inner city with talent, who with a bit of encouragement and support was really moving off to do great things. And she should never have died with her mother. And she died, frankly, because when she first smelt that fire, she stayed in her flat with her mother, believing that the fire brigade would get her out. And that did not happen. Had she sort of simply ran out the building, she'd still be alive today. But she, again, did what a lot of us who are from working class backgrounds did. You know, someone in a suit or someone in a uniform tells you to do something and you do it. And it cost her life. So I remain hugely concerned about that travesty. And also, it's interesting, it came just 4 days after the general election of 2017, a general election in which the issue of housing, which is one of the number one political and policy challenges in our countries, was not even discussed or debated, really. And yet there it was. So it was a very wounding moment, very painful moment. We obviously have an inquiry taking place, and let's see where that inquiry comes to. But there is a sense that that injustice, and inquiries sometimes do this, they take a long time to come to fruition. We mustn't forget that there is also a criminal investigation, one we hear a lot less about, and in which, frankly, many of those companies that put up that cladding, that built that building, and those that sponsored and encouraged it, I think are guilty of corporate manslaughter and should be tried in the Old Bailey. And that's what I look forward to see happening.
How do you make sense of this issue of unsafe social housing and the failure of the state to protect its most vulnerable in light of kind of these themes of tribalism and division that you've mentioned in your book?
Well, clearly, those are traditional issues of inequality, and Labour politicians since time immemorial are preoccupied with issues of inequality. But I think what I'm getting at in my book was issues that go deeper to issues of culture. So one of the most unsavory things about Grenfell is that Grenfell was, in those early days, there was a moment where all of the world seemed to look in on that tower block burning and felt a degree of pain and horror that it was happening. But very, very quickly, suddenly the people in the tower block were othered. suddenly they were less than British. Suddenly it was their fault that they'd gathered in this overcrowded circumstances. People started to come up with all these reasons that somehow diminished the fact that they had burnt to death in a preventable fire that was not their fault. That's the new tribalism that I'm talking about. It's that I'm getting at, not so much the inequality point. Of course, I touch on issues of inequality in the book, but the cultural points that then distance that empathy point from that experience. And that's what the nub of my book is really about.
Turning again briefly to the Windrush scandal of 2018, which you described not just as a violation of the rights of the thousands of individuals who suffered as a result, but also as Britain kind of disrespecting its long history with the Caribbean. So I wonder how this again featured in with this theme of tribalism.
Well, this is very painful for me. Windrush is effectively a story about how a group of people who arrived in this country to rebuild it after the war were forgotten. Their contribution was forgotten, their story was forgotten. But the most fundamental element of their story was literally whitewashed. And that was in the end that these people are the descendant of enslaved people. Their ancestors were stolen from Africa, taken across the water. They lost their culture, they lost their names. They became British citizens because first they were property as slaves, and then after emancipation, they were British citizens in a broader empire. These people then come to Britain, pushed because actually the economies of the Caribbean were in such a parlous state by the early part of the 20th century because the plantations had folded, the sugar had dried up, and times were hard actually in the Caribbean. That's why they were pushed to come to Britain to help rebuild it after the war. And then years later, them and their children are kicked out, detained, deported, denied pensions, denied housing, denied healthcare. It's a terrible, terrible story. And it's really at centrality because the country never knew the story. And we do very badly, I think, in Britain of telling that post-colonial story, fessing up to the things that the country did that were shameful, wrong, and facing the future, saying that we believe in a multicultural, multi-ethnic future because we've learned from those mistakes. That's what Wendy Williams found in the review that she did into the Windrush. That's what I said when I spoke about it in Parliament. Very, very painful, very, very sad. And until we really understand the roots of that, it's very hard to look forward. And so there is a bit of my book where I talk about Windrush and what that meant. And again, the way in which part of this new tribalism can very quickly other a group of people and diminish a group of people, and how history plays a part. And let me just say that history hasn't always got to be about guilt and shame. You know, I think when Barack Obama won his victory in 2008 in America, he told a story of America, the better angels of ourselves, and deliberately appealed to traditions in America, the tradition of Abraham Lincoln, of Kennedy, of Roosevelt, to forge this positive story. And we too can do that in this country. And you see it now. You see it now in the dealing with the coronavirus and COVID-19. Somehow the rhetoric of Boris summoning up the British spirit that won the Second World War, the sort of it's not sufficient. What the public want is expertise, understanding, proper communication about how they can protect themselves and their family, and what they're getting instead is lots of rhetoric and hubris about a moment in history that's not even correct, because Britain didn't win the war on its own. It won the war with the help of America, Russia, and a lot of people from the Commonwealth, including my ancestors. So in a sense, we're hoist by our own petard if we don't get this right.
So like all crises, just as you said, COVID-19 has affected the marginalised and the vulnerable in Britain far disproportionately. What do you make of the government's response to the crisis, and how do you see Britain coming out of the crisis?
Well, all the evidence is that we were slow on the lockdown. We were slow on getting PPE to frontline staff. We've been slow on testing, and we're slow on tracing. And as a consequence, globally, the global community look at our figures and are shocked by just how bad we have been at dealing with this crisis. At some point, there'll be an inquiry into what's happened, and we will get to the truth of all of that. I try in my brief, and I can see Keir Starmer doing this, leading the opposition, to be constructive, because in the end, we want to get out of this, and all of us have got to pull together to get out of this, not point fingers. But it's not been easy, because let's face it, clearly the government have not got this right. They've not been transparent. They've not been open. At times, Boris has not appeared to be on the detail. There have been a whole raft of issues. And clearly, there's a real worry that frontline staff in the NHS have died in their numbers, and that Black and ethnic minorities have found themselves 4 times more likely to die if they get the disease. What's going on there? Some of it will be about long-standing issues of inequality and structural racism that have been present in our society, but some of it will be to do with pathology and a whole raft of issues. People raise vitamin D deficiency as one of those issues, for example. But the point is, we still don't know those answers because the government's conducting a review that's not hugely transparent. We don't understand it. It hasn't always got the confidence of the whole community. And we still wait to hear what the results are, so people can at least protect their loved ones.
Just a final question from me. Do you see a future that is a future of victory for the Labour Party under Keir Starmer's leadership? And do you think a new chapter has opened up for Britain?
Well, look, part of my job is to offer critique, criticism, scrutiny of the government of the day. And that can sometimes sound a bit gloomy and a bit unhopeful. I want to be hugely hopeful, and am hopeful, of the millennials, of a generation that I think is fantastic, the children of the baby boomers, who will get their hands on the lever of power, and I believe deal with some of the major challenges of our time, of which the biggest, by the way, I think, is climate change. Of course I'm hopeful about Keir Starmer. In Keir, we've seen already, in his scrutiny of Boris Johnson, a sort of forensic analysis that's sober, that's serious, that's real, and that's charming with the British people. He's a straight-talking kind of guy. He's great to have as a boss, by the way. And, I think that the Labour Party are going to get into the business of broad coalition again, because you don't form a government unless you're a broad coalition that listens to people, understands where they're from, and can move from being an effective opposition to being a government in waiting. And I think that's where we are. But clearly, we're in fast-changing times. We will move on from the coronavirus to recession and a very tough economic circumstance. And that's an economic circumstance that will affect the youngest the hardest in terms of employment, will affect those already poor and deprived, and comes on the back of a previous recession and period of austerity. So we're in for very tough times. And we know that in such tough economic times, people can be seduced, can't they, by blame, by hate, by populism, by nationalism. So it's going to be a very, very challenging story. But I think that Keir and the modern Labour Party is up to the challenge.
Taking now 2 questions from the audience. The first one is from Josh at Jesus, and he says, does an elected member of parliament have a responsibility concerning the words they use and the accusations they band about? If this is the case, do you regret comparing the ERG to both the Nazis in Germany and the Nationalist Party in South Africa, before going on to say that such a comparison was not strong enough, in the process diminishing real racial issues in the past and present?
Well, look, I'd encourage you to actually read the book where I deal with this in the book, and to think about the real issues. I was talking about Jacob Rees-Mogg. I was talking about him and his association with the AfD in Germany, with people like Steve Bannon, people who are quite boldly and quite avowedly white supremacists. And I make absolutely no apology whatsoever as the descendant of enslaved people for challenging white supremacy and that tradition. And very, very sadly, you can see in not just the rhetoric, but sometimes in the policy, how some of that has engulfed parts of the right in this country. And just as I've challenged parts of my own party for anti-Semitism, I'm afraid I'm not backing off challenging those that sort of forget the stories of the 1930s. So you've got to look at what I actually said and why I said it. And I do go into some detail in the book about that, and I encourage you to look at it.
Last question from Christopher at Oxford Brookes, and he says, what needs to be done to create more role models like yourself for the Black ethnic minorities in the UK, especially those that live in marginalised areas?
Well, I think there are loads of role models, actually. I meet them every day of the week. They're teachers and head teachers. They're nurses and doctors. They're people running their own businesses. They're young people leaving communities like mine and going to Russell Group universities. There are loads of them, but the challenge sometimes in European countries with small minorities is to throw a spotlight on those that are succeeding, and not just those who are struggling and not succeeding. And so I've seen banner headlines, for example, like the problem of black men and knives. And the vast majority of black men in Britain only hold a knife when they're having a meal. And it's still a minority that would use a knife. And anyway, that's not confined solely to ethnicity. So some of it's about showcasing talent and all that's there, and some of the challenges for minority groups. Because the definition of a minority group is sometimes the majority doesn't see, doesn't know, doesn't care. But that's in many, many democracies across the world, not just in ours, of course. I do what I can to challenge, yes, but also to support, to mentor, to throw a spotlight. But I certainly challenge the premises that they're not there. They are there. They're there in droves of people succeeding despite the odds every day of the week. And let me just be clear. Yes, it's my job to critique this country, but I still believe it's one of the best countries in the world. My job is one of the most rewarding in the world, and representing our country in the House of Commons is a huge, huge, huge privilege. So despite the critique and the challenges that you would expect me to make of the government, I don't at all want to diminish where this country stands relative to many other places in the world, and why it's a privilege to be born here, to work here, and frankly to have succeeded here. And I am a product of this country. And in the book, I talk about my Englishness and how that matters to me and means something to me, it's important to me, how Peterborough shaped who I am, and Middle England shaped who I am, and how I'm proud of that as I sit here in my late 40s.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us here today, David. It has been a pleasure hosting you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.